The Eurocrats are panicking, and for bloody good reason. The whole edifice is shaking and will crumble one way or the other. But since Donald Tusk is currently leading, he knows that no matter how much he believes in the EU nonsense, his fellow countrymen and at least 2/3 of this continent simply don't believe the same thing. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so let's read what Tusk had to say and then we will comment. Hotnews.ro titles, Tusk, the President of the European Council, the EU leaders that promote utopian delusions regarding a united Europe have lost contact with the peoples of Europe. Now, for those of you who don't know, the European Council, also referred to as the Council of Ministers, and it's basically the Council of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the 28 member countries of the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, this body is the third decision-making body after the Politburo, or the European Commission, and the Supreme Soviet, currently called the European Parliament. Now, since Tusk wants to be honest, I see no reason why I should refrain from using the Soviet titles when referring to these cucks. Anyway, so the article goes like this, quote, "The EU leaders that promote utopian illusions regarding a united Europe have lost contact with their peoples and they risk losing against the Eurosceptic populists that are determined to break down the community bloc," Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, said on Monday. Tusk, who will be presiding over a summit of EU leaders next month, a few days after the Brexit referendum, levied these criticisms in a speech delivered to his conservative colleagues in the EU countries, including many supporters of a more federal Europe. "We are the ones who are today responsible in confronting various utopias against reality, such as the utopia of a Europe without nation-states, the utopia of Europe without interests and ambitions in conflicts, or the utopia of a Europe that imposes its values on the outside world," said the former Polish Prime Minister. "Obsessed by the idea of total and instantaneous integration, we have failed to see that the regular people, the citizens of Europe, do not share our Euro enthusiasm. Disillusioned with the grandiose visions of the future, the citizens are demanding that we deal with the reality of today better than we did so far. To them, Euroscepticism has become a better alternative to these illusions," added Donald Tusk. Now, ain't that cute? Now, Mr. Tusk is, of course, correct, well, almost correct, because the peoples of Europe don't demand to him and cucks like him to do a better job. What the peoples of Europe demand is for him and all the cucks like him to just get the hell out of the way. Now, there's a big difference between the two, mind you, but ultimately, this is way too little and way too late. I mean, this is the kind of talk that the EU should have had with itself, let's say, around 6 years ago. In 2010, there were still more than enough gullible fools to genuinely think that this EU nightmare could actually work. And some pointed reforms here and there implemented in 2010 might have actually saved this thing from its collision course. And by that, I mean it might have postponed the inevitable collapse by a decade or two. But that ship sailed a long time ago, and Mr. Tusk probably knows it too. I mean, he's not an idiot. Yeah, sure, he is a traitor, but he's not an idiot. You see, Mr. Tusk has gotten this position after losing the elections in Poland in a landslide. The Polish people fundamentally rejected his utopian nonsense and elected a parliament that contains exactly 0 leftist parties and only one semi-leftist party, Donald Tusk's party, which was also severely reduced in influence. Now, as a result for this fabulous performance, Mr. Tusk has been rewarded with a cushy job in Brussels. The same goes with the other president, Jean-Claude Juncker, a man whose sole merit is that he managed to lose the elections in Luxembourg. I mean, there are more people in the county I live in. When I lived in Bucharest, the neighborhood I lived in had more inhabitants than Luxembourg has today. So basically, the guy who won the Homeowners Association elections had far more legitimacy than Jean-Claude Juncker will have ever had in his entire miserable life. And the more time goes on, more people start to notice these things. I mean, why should the peoples of Europe give a flying toss about what these two losers have to say? And it is indeed starting to dawn on them that really nobody should, and indeed nobody does, actually care. And with the British referendum incoming, and with the obvious failure of the Remain campaign and their Project Fear, it is a tough period to be a Euro fanatic these days. I mean, it's tougher than the Greek debt crisis and tougher than the Spanish crisis. Because you see, back then, the markets would still listen to the Eurocrats, even though unenthusiastically. But now, the markets are completely ignoring what the Eurocrats have to say, and for bloody good reason. And increasingly, the peoples of Europe are also ignoring what they have to say, and also for bloody good reason. Basically, what Mr. Tusk is doing is to try to save face and try to reassure somehow the voting bloc that is somewhat on the right, but for some reasons completely alien to me, still believe in the EU project. The fact that the Turkish visa project was postponed isn't particularly reassuring for anyone outside of the conservatives who genuinely think that you can be for liberty and self-determination whilst supporting the Bruxellian federal dictatorship. And yes, I know Bruxellian isn't a word, but, it should be. However, there is one tiny bit of somewhat good news in this whole thing. As of July, and for the remainder of 2016, the presidency of the Council of the European Union will be assumed by Slovakia and Mr. Robert Fico. The Eurocrats aren't dying to see this happening, as Mr. Fico is one of those weird people who tend to think that national identity matters, that Islam is a bad thing to have, like a disease, and that generally Juncker can take his migrant quotas and shove them right up his soft spot, cause he ain't having any of it, no matter how loud progressives may scream. To make things worse, Mr. Fico actually reinforced his views a few days ago and made it crystal clear to everyone that he has no intention of backing down or toning down his views whilst assuming the presidency of the Council, but instead he will double down on them. And I can hardly wait for that to happen. As far as anyone can tell, the worst thing that can happen is that Brussels may take a break from bribing the Slovak politicians with their own people's money, which is something that the Slovak Prime Minister already alluded to, that he doesn't really give a toss anyway, and that the Slovak tradition that goes back centuries is a lot more important than the fiat euros that Brussels may or may not offer. Perhaps this is why Tusk is so fearful. Anyway, so this is the atmosphere in Brussels these days. A lot of tensions and the Eurocrats shitting themselves as they're starting to realize that this whole charade may end a lot sooner than anyone might have thought. Now seriously, if they want to save the European Union, maybe they should consider installing Mr. Fico as permanent president at least until 2020. I'm only half joking. Now, personally, I hope the Brexit side of the referendum, of the British referendum, wins, and then we'll get to have quite a lot of fun. Now, if Brexit loses, that's bad news for Britain, but for the rest of us it will still matter, because then the EU's behavior towards Britain will pretty much dictate the Eurosceptic narrative from that moment on. So yeah, that's really all I had to say about this. For now, at least, I'll be back on this topic, let's say after the British referendum, so in other words, when I come back from my tour of Ukraine. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching, and thank you again for your continuous support of this channel. Talk to you all soon.